Section 22 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois Doyle. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 22. The Story of the Three Sharpers and the Sultan. Story of the Sisters and the Sultana, their mother. Part 1. We are not, my lord the Sultan, natives of this city, but of Iraq, of which country our father was sovereign, and our mother his Sultana, the most beautiful woman of her time, insomuch that her fame was celebrated throughout distant regions. It chanced that in our infancy our father the Sultan marched upon a hunting excursion throughout his dominions for some months, leaving his vizier to conduct affairs at the capital. Not long after the departure of the Sultan, our mother, taking the air on the roof of the palace, which adjoined that of the vizier, who was then sitting upon his terrace, her image was reflected in a mirror, which he held in his hand. He was fascinated with her beauty, and resolved, if possible, to seduce her into infidelity and compliance with his wishes. The day following, he sent the female superintendent of his harem with a package containing a most superb dress and many inestimable jewels to the Sultana, requesting her acceptance of them, and that she would allow him to see her either at the palace or at his own house. My mother, when the old woman was admitted into her apartments, received her with kindness, supposing that she must be entrusted with some confidential message from the vizier respecting the affairs of her husband, or with letters from him. The old woman, having paid her abeyance, opened the bundle and displayed the rich dress and dazzling jewels. When my mother, admiring them much, inquired the value, and what merchant had brought them to dispose of. The wretched old woman, supposing that the virtue of the Sultana would not be proof against such a valuable present, impudently disclosed the passion of the vizier, upon which my mother, indignant with rage at this insult offered to her virtue and dignity, drew a saber, which was near, and exerting all her strength, struck off the head of the procuress, which, with the body, she commanded her attendants to cast into the common sewer of the palace. The vizier, finding his messenger did not return, the next day dispatched another, to signify that he had sent a present to the Sultana, but had not heard whether it had been delivered. My mother commanded the infamous wretch to be strangled, and the corpse to be thrown into the same place as that of the old woman. But she did not make public the vizier's baseness, hoping that he would reform. He, however, continued every day to send a female domestic, and my mother to treat her in the same way as the others till the Sultan's return. But my mother, not wishing to destroy the vizier, and still trusting that he would repent of his conduct, for in other respects he was a faithful and prudent minister, kept his treachery a secret from my father. Some years after this, the Sultan, my father, resolved on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and having, as before, left the vizier in charge of his kingdom, departed. When he had been gone 10 days, the vizier, still rapturously in love, and yet presumptuously hoping to attain his wishes, sent a female domestic, who, being admitted into the apartment of the Sultana, said, "For heaven's sake, have compassion on my master, for his heart is devoted to love, his senses are disturbed, and his body is wasted away. Pity his condition, revive his heart, and restore his health by the smiles of condescension." When my mother heard this insolent message, she, in a rage, commanded her attendants to seize the unfortunate bearer, and having strangled her, to leave the carcass for public view in the outer court of the palace, but without divulging the cause of her displeasure. Her orders were obeyed. When the officers of state and others saw the body, they informed the vizier, who, resolving to be revenged, desired them for the present to be silent, and, on the Sultan's return, he would make known on what account the Sultana had put to death his domestic, of which they could bear testimony. When the time of the Sultan's return from Mecca approached, and the treacherous vizier judged he was on his march, he wrote and dispatched to him the following letter. After prayers for thy health, be it known that since thy absence the Sultana has sent to me 5 times, requesting improper compliances, to which I would not consent in return for answer, that however she might wish to abuse my sovereign, I could not do it, for I was left by him guardian of his honor and his kingdom. To say more would be superfluous. The messenger reached the Sultan's camp when distant 8 days' journey from the city, and delivered the letter. On reading it, the countenance of my father became pale. His eyes rolled with horror. He instantly ordered his tents to be struck, and moved by forced marches till he arrived within 2 days' journey of the capital. He then commanded a halting day, and dispatched 2 confidential attendants with orders to conduct our innocent and unfortunate mother, with us 3 sisters, a day's distance from the city, and then to put us to death. They accordingly dragged us from the harem, and carried us into the country, but on arriving at the spot intended for our execution, their hearts were moved with compassion, for our mother had conferred many obligations on these men and their families. They said one to another, "By heavens, we cannot murder them," and informed us of what the vizier had written to our father. Upon which the Sultana exclaimed, "God knows that he hath most falsely accused me." And she then related to them all that she had done with the strictest fidelity. The men were moved even to tears at her misfortunes, and said, "We are convinced that thou hast spoken truly." They then caught some fawns of the antelope, killed them, and having required an undergarment from each of us, dipped it in the blood, after which they broiled the flesh, with which we satisfied our hunger. Our preservers now bade us farewell, saying, "We entrust you to the protection of the Almighty, who never forsaketh those who are committed to his care," and then departed from us. We wandered for 10 days in the desert, living on such fruits as we could find, without beholding any signs of population, when, at length, fortunately, we reached a verdant spot, abounding in various sorts of excellent vegetables and fruits. Here also was a cave, in which we resolved to shelter ourselves till a caravan might pass by. On the 4th day of our arrival, one encamped near our asylum. We did not discover ourselves, but when the caravan marched speedily, followed its track at some distance, and after many days of painful exertion reached this city, where, having taken up our lodging in a sere, we returned thanks to the Almighty, assister of the distressed innocent, for our miraculous escape from death and the perils of the desert. We must now quit for a while the unfortunate Sultana and her daughters, to learn the adventures of the Sultan, her husband. As he drew near his capital, the treacherous vizier, attended by the officers of the government and the principal inhabitants of the city, came out to meet him, and both high and low congratulated his safe return from the sacred pilgrimage. The Sultan, as soon as he had alighted at his palace, retired with the vizier alone, and commanded him to relate the particulars of the atrocious conduct of his wife. Upon which he said, "My lord, the Sultana in your absence dispatched to me a slave, desiring me to visit her, but I would not, and I put the slave to death that the secret might be hidden, hoping she might repent of her weakness. But she did not, and repeated her wicked invitation 5 times. On the 5th, I was alarmed for your honor, and acquainted you of her atrocious behavior." The Sultan, on hearing the relation of the vizier, held down his head for some time in profound thought, then lifting it up, commanded the 2 attendants, whom he had dispatched with orders to put his wife and children to death, to be brought before him. On their appearance, he said, "What have you done in execution of the charge I gave you?" They replied, "We have performed that which you commanded to be done, and as a testimony of our fidelity, behold these garments, dyed with the blood of the offenders." The Sultan took the garments, but the recollection of his beauteous consort, her former affectionate endearments, of the happiness he had enjoyed with her, and of the innocence of his guiltless children, so affected his mind that he wept bitterly and fainted away. On his recovery, he turned to the vizier and said, "Is it possible thou canst have spoken the truth?" He replied, "I have." The Sultan, after a long pause, again said to the two attendants, "Have you really put to death my innocent children with their guilty mother?" They remained silent. The Sultan exclaimed, "Why answer you not, and wherefore are ye silent?" They replied, "My lord, the honest man cannot support a lie, for lying is the distinction of traitors." When the vizier heard these words, his color changed, his whole frame was disordered, and a trembling seized him, which the Sultan, perceiving, he said to the attendants, "What mean you by remarking that lying is the distinction of traitors? Is it possible that ye have not put them to death? Declare the truth instantly, or by the God who hath appointed me guardian of his people, I will have you executed with the most excruciating torments." The two men now fell at the feet of the Sultan and said, "Dread sovereign, we conveyed, as thou commandest us, the unfortunate Sultana and thy daughters to the middle of the desert. When we informed them of the accusation of the vizier and thy orders concerning them, the Sultana, after listening to us with fortitude, exclaimed, 'There is no refuge or asylum but with the Almighty. From God we came, and to God we must return. But if you put us to death, you will do it wrongfully, for the treacherous vizier hath accused me falsely, and he alone is guilty.' She then informed us of his having endeavored to corrupt her by rich presents, and that she had put his messengers to death." The Sultan at these words exclaimed in agony, "Have ye slain them, or do they yet live?" "My lord," replied the attendants, "we were so convinced of the innocence of the Sultana that we could not put her to death. We caught some fawn antelopes, killed them, and having dipped these garments belonging to the abused mother and your children in their blood, dressed the flesh, and gave it to our unfortunate mistress and thy daughters, after which we said to them, 'We leave you in charge of a gracious God, who never deserts his trust. Your innocence will protect you.' We then left them in the midst of the desert and returned to the city." The Sultan turned in fury towards the vizier and exclaimed, "Wretched traitor, and is it thus thou hast estranged from me my beloved wife and innocent children?" The self-convicted minister uttered not a word, but trembled like one afflicted with the palsy. The Sultan commanded instantly an enormous pile of wood to be kindled, and the vizier, being bound hand and foot, was forced into an engine and cast from it into the fire, which rapidly consumed him to ashes. His house was then razed to the ground, his effects left to the plunder of the populace, and the women of his harem and his children sold for slaves. We now return to the three princesses and their mother. When the Sultan had heard their adventures, he sympathized with their misfortunes, and was astonished at the fortitude